Here in the UK, Sky News has spoken to one family which have been waiting years to buy their home as part of the government's Right to Buy scheme. The programme was expanded by David Cameron in 2015 when the government partnered with the National Housing Association. It was a move Cameron said would help more than 1 million people to buy their first homes. But the scheme has been heavily criticised, and now it's suggested that it may be quietly dropped. Sky's political correspondent Lewis Goodall reports.
Positivity is my superpower.
Ray and Jamie Barrow are just two of 1.3 million people in limbo. They voted Conservative twice after being promised by a Prime Minister, no less, that they'd get the right to buy their housing association home, just as council tenants were 30 years before.
1.3 million more people given the chance to become homeowners. A promise made, a promise kept by this government.
But the promise wasn't kept, and 3 years on, they're still waiting.
I feel really misled, and I feel really quite sad about it. And to be honest, I feel like we've let our children down by relying on what they've said in their manifesto, because we want to provide security for them. We want to make sure, you know, they're set up for life. They need their home, and
we can't
give it to them at the moment.
We can't call it.
The big idea for this scheme was that it would be funded by selling off council housing in expensive areas, like this estate in East London, and then using that money to compensate housing associations for the loss of their properties. Many thought it was harebrained, and that it would deplete the social housing stock yet further. They've been proved right. Figures seen by Sky News confirm that after all the hype and the hope, only 55 sales have gone through in a smattering of pilot areas. The government will not publicly confirm whether or not the scheme will be rolled out.
It was always quite difficult. One, I think the numbers as they were originally didn't quite work, from the start, but also the politics around it are very, very tricky.
There had consequently been pressure inside government for the scheme to be totally scrapped, not least because selling off council homes to pay for it was thought to be unworkable.
My understanding is that is no longer the case. A senior government source has told me that they're going to drop the idea of selling off council housing to pay for all this. Now, that will come as a relief to many councils, but the same source told me that they will continue with the scheme. In a post-Grenfell world, they're keen to show that the government still has some ideas to deal with a housing crisis. But the problem they now have is they don't know how they're going to pay for it.
And we're talking serious money, potentially over £3 billion. And it's hoped within government they can come up with something before November's budget. It's possible they could tighten eligibility, make the numbers smaller, but in so doing could still disappoint hundreds of thousands, like the Barrows, who were told they would enjoy exactly the same rights as council tenants.
So if you had a message to a minister, if they were watching, what would it be?
So I tweet him every day, and he ignores me. Basically, I just want to know what is going on, where we stand. He said that he wants to give us some clarity, so please give it to us sooner rather than later so we can get on with our lives.
Even if it's a yes or a no?
If it's a yes or a no, we just want to know.
The Conservative dream of home ownership was dangled in front of them. It's a hard dream to let go. Lewis Goodall, Sky News, Billericay.
Well, Right to Buy was, of course, a signature Margaret Thatcher policy, but does it still work today? Joining me now are Daniel Mahoney, who is Deputy Director and Head of Economic Research at the Centre for Policy Studies, and Tom Copley, who's a Labour's housing spokesperson in the London Assembly here. Welcome to you both. I mean, given what Lewis was saying in that report, is Right to Buy still working as a policy?
I think it is still working. I mean, some people are taking advantage of it. And I don't think it has a broader impacts on the wider housing market. I mean, if you look at London, for example, in the last 3 months, about 500 households have taken up the Right to Buy, and that's only about 0.1% of the housing stock. So I think if you tried to make curtailments to it, you would restrict that opportunity and you wouldn't solve the housing crisis.
What about the houses that are being bought and going private being replaced? I mean, that's not happening, is it?
Well, I think that's a symptom of a problem with our housing market more broadly. If we had rents that were much more affordable, there wouldn't be the incentive to do that. And actually, if you look at under Thatcher, when there was a much bigger Right to Buy sell-off, you didn't have that move towards going into the private rented sector. So I think we need to try and solve some of the other issues in our housing market.
Do you think it's working, albeit for a small number of people, as Daniel was saying?
No, I don't. I mean, first of all, right to buy is the largest scale privatisation in the history of this country, and unprecedentedly bad value for money, selling off these assets at a discount. And I think at a time, particularly now, where we have not just a shortage of housing overall, but a chronic shortage of social housing, we shouldn't be selling off the precious few social houses that we have.
If it was being replaced one for one, I mean, that would actually regenerate the housing stock, wouldn't it? And that would be a good thing.
Well, actually, the big issue with the right to buy was less the principle of people being able to buy their council flat, and more the fact that the councils were basically banned from replacing them.
Sure.
The replacements we're seeing now are only replacements for some of the additional homes that were sold under the scheme when it was reinvigorated.
Yeah.
But they're not like for like. This is the issue. When the government talks about one-for-one replacement, these are not like for like. They're not on the same rent level. They're often at higher rents, up to 80% of market rents. And we're seeing, you know, four-bedroom family homes being replaced by one-bedroom flats.
So overall, it's depleting the affordable housing stock.
Well, as I say, it's very marginal towards that issue. As I say, if you look at the last 3 months in London, for example, that is just 0.1% of the local authority housing stock, and that doesn't even include any of the stock owned by housing associations. I think
but just saying it's small is not answering the question as to whether it's doing damage.
As I say, it's completely around the margins. The thing that's doing the most damage is our planning system, the fact that public bodies own about 40% of brownfield sites and they're just sitting on them. Obviously, we won't review the green belt. These are the main issues. As I said, if you could make curtailments to right to buy, you'll just restrict that opportunity to a lot of people, and you won't solve the housing crisis.
I mean that is the point, isn't it? That as originally designed, the idea of right to buy was better off people are able to own their own homes. This was a way of extending it to people on lower incomes securely and giving them a little bit of a stake in society. Is there anything wrong with that, do you think?
Well, I think there's a strong argument that, you know, council housing was built as a public good for the benefit of the present and future generations, not just for the person who happens to be living there at the time. But of course, back when we were building an awful lot of council housing, house buying was cheaper anyway, because there was a much greater supply. There was far less. I mean, one of the big problems we've seen is the growth in buy-to-let, more demand from private landlords, often who buy up former housing stock that was sold under the right to buy. We've got to deal with that issue as well.
But that principle of a property-owning democracy, do you have a problem with that?
No, not at all. And I think, I mean, actually, it sounds counterintuitive, but the more council housing you build, the more affordable it will become for people to be able to buy a house.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think if you look under the Thatcher era, when there was a much bigger sell-off, actually waiting lists for council housing and social housing fell by 200,000. And that's because, you know, you had a big right to buy, but you had much higher levels of building of both social and private sector
But that's
homes.
not happening now, is it?
It's not happening now, but that's the primary problem. And as I said, this scheme is really marginal to the overall issue, not just of social rents, but also private rents.
Do you get the sense that the government actually is winding it down, to be honest, and concentrating on other things?
Well, I mean, the more generous discounts are still in place, so I don't think there's an overt policy. Obviously, they're trying to extend this to housing associations. As your package showed, there are some issues with that, but I think they've tried to extend that in a sensible way. They've piloted it in 5 separate places. Now they're going to do it on a regional basis, and I think if they go forward with that, a replacement one-for-one, you know, needs to be in place.
I mean, the extension to housing associations, I mean, it really hasn't got off the ground, I think, for good reason. Even Margaret Thatcher didn't extend right to buy to housing association properties. And this was a policy that was put in the Conservative manifesto under David Cameron when they thought they'd never have to implement it because they could drop it in coalition negotiations with the Liberal Democrats. I mean, it's an astonishingly bad policy, which, of course, was going to be paid for by selling off high-value council homes.
So if you think the need is for council houses for renting, how do you stimulate that market? Where do you get the money to, and indeed the land, I suppose, to actually start building more homes?
Well, a lot of councils, one thing a lot of councils do have is the land, but they don't have the finance to be able necessarily to build on it. I mean, one thing we need is for the government to remove the borrowing cap on councils. It is easier for a council to borrow to buy a shopping centre, and many are, than it is for councils to borrow to build housing, and I think that's absurd.
Do you think that's right? That should be changed?
I think loosening of some finance for councils, I think, could be a potential way forward. But I don't think that's the only reason why councils aren't building. Often they don't have the expertise. It's not just councils, of course. A lot of other public bodies like TfL, the MOD, own lots of land, but they hoard it for various reasons. So it's, you need a big sort of approach to this.
Well, TfL is now developing its land. I mean, TfL have got a target of 10,000 homes started on its land by 2020 because it's losing all of its grant from the government.
Do you think there has been a change in the culture of the government? I mean, there's this reported conversation between David Cameron and George Osborne where one says the other, why would we build more council homes and create more Labour voters? Do you think Theresa May is different?
I'm not sure about the political workings of it, but I think if you, in the lead up to this budget, you can see there are these conversations going on. And I think, I think Philip Hammond and Sajid Javid have both made, big radical proposals. As I said, I don't think it's just money that's needed, but we need all these other, things.
Do you think this government is different from the May government, is different from the Cameron government in terms of its attitude?
I think there's certainly been I think there's certainly been a shift in the rhetoric. It was quite nice to hear a Conservative Prime Minister, sort of perhaps slightly through gritted teeth, say that we need councils to build if we're going to solve the housing crisis, and that council housing is important. But that has to be, the words have to be matched by action and by money. And this is, the Prime Minister has prioritised £10 billion to further inflate house prices with Help to Buy, and only £2 billion to build new affordable housing. I think they need to switch those priorities round.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next...